Have you ever wondered what's about to happen in the economy in the next few years? Well, today we were joined by Dr. Scott Burns of Southeastern Louisiana State University, who reveals some game-changing ideas that are going to really affect what's going to happen in the economy in the next couple of years. So the question is, will you be ready when it hits, or will you be scrambling to catch up? Great to see you today. Welcome to the Will Frederick Podcast, where we talk about real estate, wealth building, money, and life. And today we have a very special guest from our own Southeastern Louisiana State University, Dr. Scott Burns. And he is originally from Louisiana, graduated from LSU, went and traveled all over and got some really great additional education, and went to George Mason University in the D.C. area, where he got his doctorate, and he came back home, and now he teaches right here in Hammond. And so we're excited to talk to him a little bit today about economics and how the market works and how different things kind of apply to our daily lives. So welcome, Scott. How you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thank you for
Dr.
having
Burns.
me.
I'm sorry. Let me just correct myself, Dr. Burns. So great to have you on the podcast today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I usually tell people, don't call me doctor, because I told you earlier, I kind of view that as stolen valor almost, because I have friends who went to medical school, the whole 8 years of, but I kind of changed course on that because I had students who basically told me, look, the professor thing is just too hard to say. Can we just call you Dr. Burns? But to me, it's always weird because, like, if I'm on a plane and somebody goes into cardiac arrest, I actually had the situation happen once where somebody was joking with me, like, oh, you just got your PhD. I should be calling you Dr. Scott, Dr. Burns. And I was like, but somebody went into, like, had a heart condition on the plane, and they announced, does anyone know a doctor who's on board? Is there any doctor? And the woman right next to me said, actually, this young man is a doctor, because I just overheard my conversation.
You're like, I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. Yeah, sure.
But, yep.
I don't blame. Well, I won't confuse that. You're a doctor of economics, right? Is that the degree, doctor of economics?
It's a PhD in economics.
PhD in economics. Gotcha. All right, cool. Well, so that's awesome. We're excited to have you. And so lots of people have questions about the market and how it works. But before we start that, I wanted to give you the opportunity to give us a little bio on yourself, your background. I gave you the brief version, but give any more detail you'd like.
Yeah. So I was born and raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Since a lot of your listeners are probably from this region, I went to a school called Parkview Baptist for all 13 years leading up to going to college at LSU. So went to LSU, and I was at LSU at a very interesting time. So 2008 would have been my freshman year. I don't have to tell you what was going on in the macro economy in 2008.
Yeah.
Giant housing bubble that burst. And so even though I was originally going to college to one day go to law school, so I was a political science and history major, and I also did some mass comms. I worked in journalism. I had no intention of studying business. I thought business was the most boring thing ever. My dad works in finance, so I thought, okay, I don't want to do that but I did get talked into taking. My dad said, why don't you at least get a business minor? Just, get some baseline knowledge.
Sure.
And I was the only person in the newsroom at the Reveille, the school paper, who was taking business classes. And so whenever the economy just went into the tank, they basically said, does anyone here have like any econ classes they've taken? Like, can anyone write comprehensive
just something
about this? And I volunteered, and that kind of led me down a rabbit hole where I started listening to economics podcasts. I started reading books in my spare time, God forbid, on economics, and finding it fascinating. And then I kind of found out, like, wait a minute, the whole history of economics is actually, it's not boring business stuff necessarily, and I love business stuff, so I'm not trying to dismiss it, but do you know by chance who the father of economics is? The very famous name?
Is it Adam Smith?
Adam Smith, indeed.
Okay,
you know what he was back in the 1700s in Scotland?
No, what was he?
He was the most famous philosopher of the time, or at least in that region.
Interesting.
He was one of the founding fathers of the Scottish Enlightenment, which is my favorite of all the Enlightenments. The ideas that led to, our founding fathers and their beliefs, from David Hume, John Locke, Adam Smith, all these people. Basically, I kind of realized, like, wait a minute, economics is really closely entwined with politics, philosophy, history,
Big time.
all these things I did find interesting and read in my spare time. So that's
it's so very practical. Yeah, economics is so very practical. I don't know if you've read the book Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. Have you heard of that?
I've read that one.
Morgan Housel is and we've actually reviewed the book on the podcast before, but it's one of my favorite books on money. And Morgan Housel's an economics writer, so he's got some really great bona fides in that. Bona
fides.
Bona fides. I've heard it said bona fides and bona fides, and then I just mashed the two of them. So anyway, bona fides, and so It's a really pleasant book to read, very broken down for the everyday person.
Yeah.
That's what I want to do for economics for some of my listeners and for my clients, because the more we know, the better decisions we can make. And so that's where I wanted to bring you on today, and I'm excited about this. So
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
So I have some questions. So and a lot of it's going to surround the local market, which I know you're more of a macro guy. So anything that you do to take the macro and bring it down to our micro level would be helpful. And so some of these questions might sound kind of canned, but I'm going to go ahead and ask them anyway, and we can kind of take them where we want to go. Okay. What key trends are you observing in the local real estate market or national real estate market, and how do they compare to the national trends, if you do notice anything that's Louisiana specific?
Well, I'll start kind of at the macro level, just because the big thing that people watching right now are going to be listening this month are going to be asking about is, okay, I read in the newspaper that the Federal Reserve, this really important thing that's in like Washington, D.C. or something, lowered interest rates. Does that mean that now I'm going to be able to, if I want to buy a new home, get a much lower interest rate? Am I going to be paying a lot less for my house note? And so one thing that we should expect, it's true that the Federal Reserve, that's the central bank of the United States, they're basically in charge of the money supply, how much money we have floating around our economy, how many reserves banks are holding on to. Last month, they came out and announced that they were going to lower their target interest rate by 50 basis points. Right. 50 basis points is our fancy way in economics and finance of saying 0.5%.
Yeah, 0.50.
It's a pretty big decrease.
It was a very big decrease,
when the Fed makes those decisions, we expect it like in 25 basis points increments. So that surprised some people.
So just to give historical context here, what does that mean it is at right now?
So it's
a range, right? They say
it is a range, and I'm trying to remember exactly what it is now. If it's about 4.5% or so, I'd have to look that up.
I think it's I should know this too, but I think it's like 5.5 or 5 to 5.25 is the range. So it was 5.5 to 5.75. They lowered it by 50 basis points.
Right.
Do you recall? Well, the last time, and you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the last time they lowered rates was several years ago because it was so low for so long. And the last 12 times they did anything, they raised it. And this was started back in 2020, I believe it was.
2020, 2021, especially when inflation started to heat up in 2022. You can kind of think about the Fed's control of interest rates and the money supplies. When the economy gets too hot, they need to tap the brakes. That's when they're going to try to increase interest rates a little bit. And even though when you read newspaper headlines, it sounds like the Fed has a magic wand and they just decree, okay, interest rates have gone up now from 2% to 2.5%. That's actually not how it works. In practice, the way the Fed raises interest rates is it adjusts the money supply. So if the Fed prints more money, puts more money into the economy, injects more liquidity into banks, then that has the effect of lowering interest rates, because now if you're a bank and you've got more reserves sitting in your vaults, you can afford to make more loans at lower rates, right?
Right.
Okay, look, these reserves don't do us any good if they're just piling up, collecting dust in our vault. Why don't we, instead of charging 6% on a mortgage, we'll charge 5%. So that's kind of the mechanism. We call that sometimes in economics the money transmission mechanism. Okay. It's easier when you're a journalist to just write a short headline that says the Fed cuts its target rate by 0.5%, because everyone knows what interest rates are. A lot of people pay mortgage notes and things like that, so they can comprehend, okay, this means that it's going to be cheaper to borrow now.
Yeah.
But what's really happening is the Fed is adjusting the money supply, and that kind of trickles down throughout the economy. And another thing that's kind of worth noting too about this is whenever we talk about the Fed adjusting its target for interest rates, it targets something called the federal funds rate. That literally means the interest rate that banks lend to each other very short term, like overnight loans from one bank to another. It's one of the most liquid, short-term rates you can think of in the economy, but it's the one that the Fed has the most control over, because the Fed controls how much money there is. It controls how many reserves banks have. But that doesn't mean, the fact that they lowered the target Fed funds rate by 0.5% doesn't mean that every interest rate in the economy now is going to magically fall by 0.5%.
Because most people don't realize the Fed funds, when that bank or when that newspaper puts that big headline, Fed drops the rate by 0.5%. The only rate people normally care about is their mortgage interest rate, or maybe a credit card rate.
Note,
Right. But they're not worried. They don't even understand what the Fed funds rate is. And that's one of the big things I want to help explain to people is, and that's what I do for my job a lot of times. I'm like, they're like, wait, I thought the Fed cut it by 0.5%. How come the rates actually went up? I don't know if you realize that the mortgage interest rates actually ticked up just slightly after the Fed funds rate went down by 0.5%. Everybody was like, what's going on,
Yeah. And the reason for that is, if you think
explain
about
it.
the Fed funds rate, we said that's like the shortest term rate in the economy. Like that's literally overnight loans from one bank to another, what they charge each other basically at an annualized rate. But a mortgage is not a super short term loan. It is one of the longest term loans.
Right,
You
exactly.
have a 10-year, 20, 30-year. So the better approximation for what's going to happen to mortgage rates is to look at not a short term overnight rate, but what we call the 10-year Treasury rate.
So I want to ask about the 10-year Treasury rate, and I want you to get that to explain it to me and our listeners.
Yeah.
However, I'd also heard it explained like this, because when the Fed funds rate changes, that's an indication of what's going on with inflation. Because they lowered it, it means that inflation is more under control, because they had to raise it to bring inflation back under control, which is what they
Breaks
did.
the economy.
Right.
Inflation was getting too hot. We got to
Right.
slow it down, so we're going to raise rates. Yep.
So when I'm lending money, if I'm a lender and I have a 30-year mortgage that I want to lend to you, and I know inflation is 9%, which is I think where it tapped.
That's about where it
capped out. Peaked out last year around this time, I think.
Probably a little bit more than, but yes, about a year and a half ago.
Yeah, November or like October, November, September 2023. And so the Fed, if I'm a lender during that time period, I've got to say, well, my money is going to be worth that much less this time next year. So I've got to raise the rate at which I'm lending to you in order just to make my money back.
Yeah.
Right? Would that be a fair way to translate it?
Very fair. In economics, we always distinguish between real versus nominal. That just means adjusted for inflation versus not adjusted for inflation.
Right.
Because you're right. If you,
Nominal means in name only, right? So a dollar is like a dollar bill is a dollar.
Right.
But it's worth less next year than it is today.
the gist of it really is that if you're a bank and you were charging, say, 5% nominal interest rate on a loan, you know, you lend somebody $100, 5% interest rate, that means that they're going to pay you back $105 at the end of the year. If inflation winds up being more than 5%, then in real terms, so adjusting for inflation, you've actually lost money. Because,
Right.
yeah, you get paid back $105, but it can't buy you what even $100 bought whenever you made the loan. So for a bank, if you could go back and redo that loan, you'd say, okay, if inflation winds up being 10% this year and I want to get a 5% real or inflation adjusted rate of return, I better charge an interest rate of, say, 15%.
15%.
That way, whenever I subtract out the 10% inflation, the fact that the dollars I'm getting paid back in are going to be worth 10% less, I still actually have an inflation-adjusted positive rate of return.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why you saw banks, especially over the past few years, raising their mortgage rates, raising their interest rates on loans, is because a lot of them, quite frankly, they did not have a very good time in 2021, 2022, whenever inflation started going up, because they had these loans for only 2, 3, 4%. Heck,
Right.
I'll use myself as an example. I got very lucky. I bought my first house in January of 2021.
Perfect. Yeah.
Awesome timing.
Yeah.
I was paying a 2.6% rate on my mortgage,
Yeah.
which is just crazy for a first-time home buyer who was 29 or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm sure that if the bank had its druthers, if it could go back and do that loan again, knowing that inflation was going to go from 1% to 9% over the next couple of years, they probably wouldn't have locked me in at a 2.6% interest rate, right?
For 30 years, probably, right?
Yeah. I'm very glad they did.
Well, and that brings up a great point that I talk to people about when it comes to investing in real estate, because when you leverage your money and you invest in real estate, there's something that's called, that a guy named Jason Hartman, he's another podcaster, he calls it inflation-induced debt destruction. Because part of the reason that the inflation keeps going is because our federal government has borrowed so much money.
Oh, yeah.
They have to get out of debt some kind of way, so they're going to make sure inflation still happens. They don't want it to be at 9%, but 2 or 3% is good, because the dollars that they're bringing in are inflated dollars compared to the times when they made the loan. And so as you're paying off the debt, you're actually the debt is becoming smaller and smaller in terms of nominal dollars.
Yeah.
Then you're getting out of debt just because of inflation.
Yeah.
So that's what an investor can do the same thing. If the government's going to borrow money, hey, I just assume borrow money too, and they're going to make sure inflation happens, and kind of I can get that money, I can reduce that debt just because I'm paying it off in nominal dollars. As the dollar shrinks or grows, and how do I put this? As the dollar buys less and less, I'm still paying off the same payment on my interest rate.
Right.
Which is the point you're making,
Yeah.
about 2.6%.
In my classes, we talk about the fact that unexpected inflation, it causes what we call debtor-creditor injustice, because unexpected inflation really helps you if you're a debtor. It means that you get to pay back your debts in dollars that are worth way less than anybody expected.
Bingo. That's exactly, yeah, it's a better way to put it. Keep going.
The mirror side of that, or the reverse side of the coin, is basically, okay, if you're a lender, you got screwed over. Like you were expecting that inflation was going to be low, and so, but you're getting paid back in dollars that are worth significantly less. That has very bad impacts on the economy, because if you're a bank and basically you've been kind of screwed over by unexpected inflation, you're going to be a lot more hesitant to make loans, especially to like risky investment projects, like a small business loan to somebody who's starting a new company, or a mortgage loan to a first-time home buyer. It makes you a lot more risk averse whenever you've been burned by inflation, and so you don't want to make that 2.6% mortgage loan to a first-time home buyer anymore.
Yeah, so it's really, it kind of, weirdly enough, it pays to be in debt sometimes. Dave Ramsey, close your ears. So it can be very helpful to you because of that debt reduction, inflation-induced debt reduction. So you were, I interrupted you before because you were going to launch into explaining the 10-year Treasury yield as an indication of interest rates. You'd speak to that a little bit?
Oftentimes, if you look at like average mortgage interest rates across the entire country, at least, it usually tracks about 2 to 2.5% above that 10-year Treasury rate. And the reason why that's a better rate to look at than, say, the short-run federal funds rate is because, again, that 10-year rate's a long-run rate. And we've been living in a very weird world for the past couple of years where you had what we call in economics an inverted yield curve. All that means is that usually a long-term loan, say a 10-year loan, is going to have a higher interest rate than a short-term loan, like a 1-year loan, because you're taking more risk. If you lock somebody in for a loan for 10 years, a lot more can go wrong over the course of 10 years. You're parting way with your money as a lender for a longer period of time, so the borrower is going to have to compensate you with a higher interest rate on that. Well, usually, like I said, we expect that the long-term rate is going to be higher than short-term rates. The opposite happened the past few years. We've actually had short-term rates that were higher than long-term rates. That usually is not too sustainable. You don't see that last too long. And in fact, a lot of economists point to an inverted yield curve as being a good predictor of recessions. And most people for the past 2 years have expected, okay, all the economic indicators are flashing red lights right now saying you're about to enter a recession. Be careful, be careful. Somehow we've managed to avoid one. Fingers crossed, knock on wood. We hope that we continue to do that. But
so when you say recession, this is a great segue into one of my next questions because I want to get to talking about the housing market. When you say recession, I think most people think back to 2008, 2005, 6, and 7 when the market was crashing, all that stuff. That's what people think is recession. I've had so many people become worried. Even 4 or 5 years ago, they were like, man, the crash is coming, the crash is coming. And I even started listening to some people that were thinking that, and I was like, hey, be a little conservative. This is why you should never listen to people that predict because nobody's got a crystal ball. I was even telling people, in 18, 19, 20, you may not want to, you might want to hold off a little bit. The market could be making a correction soon. And then what happened after that? The market went up by 40% since then. So be careful when you do that. But my question, I guess, is how do those things affect, when you say recession, this inverted yield curve is indicating we might be coming up on a recession. And I think the Fed is basically trying to do that in a very small way, trying to create a little bit of,
they're trying to lower short-term rates and hopefully normalize that yield curve so that we get back to normal. Basically.
And cool down inflation. So they don't want us to tank and go in the toilet again like it did a few years ago. But what will that mean for housing prices?
Well,
in your opinion?
What that should mean is that I would expect to see over the next year or two that mortgage rates do come down a little bit. What has surprised some people, and we kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, is a lot of people say, okay, wait a minute, the Fed just lowered interest rates by 0.5 point. Shouldn't the average mortgage rate nationwide have fallen by about 0.5 point at least? And the answer is no, because in part, some of that's already been baked in. We've known for about 6 months or so that the Fed was very likely going to cut rates. It was more of a question of how much. Is it going to be a smaller 25 basis point cut or what they might up doing, the bigger one? So the reason why you haven't seen a sharp decrease in mortgage rates is because a lot of that was kind of baked in already. A lot of people expected this rate cut, and so it was gradually going down before this, and so that's why it hasn't necessarily gone down much more. But one of the things that we mentioned too was that they've actually ticked up a little bit, and part of the reason behind that is, as you know, working in real estate, there's been a lot of buyers who have been sitting on the sideline for the past couple years, with rates being super high and everything. And one of the results of the Fed cutting rates is that you're going to see a lot of buyers who are not in the market right now.
That's right.
Right back in. So what is that going to do for the demand for housing? It's going to increase it.
Thank you. So, yes, that's what I've been telling people, and people don't realize that. Like, I'm just going to wait for the rate to come down. Well, guess what happens when the rate comes down, Mr. Buyer? Everybody's on the sidelines. You're on the sidelines waiting. Everybody's going to be wanting to do that.
Yep.
And then it's supply and demand kicks in, and what happens, Mr. Economics, doctor? What happens with supply and demand?
Yeah, in terms of supply and demand,
and the prices.
When you have an increase in demand like that, when you got more people showing up to the auction, that's going to bid up the price, right?
Right.
So,
and we're already in a limited. I mean, and maybe you can speak to this nationwide, but can you tell me about housing inventory nationwide? What have you heard about that? I don't know if you study that.
I've looked at that a little bit. You've seen a slowdown in housing construction, things like that over the past couple of years because rates are high, and that's not just bad if you're somebody who's buying a house. If you're a builder and you're taking out debt to build homes and hire workers and do things like that, past couple of years has not been a great time to do that. So one of the hopes, at least, is that on the supply side of the market, one of the things that lower rates do is you'll typically see a lot more construction companies go out and say, okay, we've been kind of shelving this development for a few years now because rates are so high. We don't know if there's going to be demand. It's expensive for us to build right now. I think hopefully what you'll see is an increase in the housing supply to kind of help us catch up with, the trends that we had before all this craziness with inflation and higher rates.
Well, and we've also had a great increase in building costs. As well. So in addition to, so people haven't been able to afford to buy houses that are new builds because, so that's dampened our production of houses. So we're really sitting at a disadvantage from an inventory standpoint. And that's what we watch in the real estate market when it comes to supply of inventory. That's going to be a bigger dictator of prices of houses because it's supply and demand, right? If you have limited supply and steady demand or increased demand, like you're talking about when the rates go down, what's that going to do to the price of a house? It's going to drive it up. Yeah. The demand increases, but the supply doesn't increase as fast. Yeah. So prices have to go up.
And if I'm not mistaken, over the past 5 or 6 years, I want to say that the median house price in the United States is up pretty dramatically.
Significant,
right?
significant.
50% is the number that I kind of had in mind.
I think it's probably not too far off of that. Yeah. And locally, it's probably a little bit less than that.
Right.
However, I mean, we've seen a dramatic increase. Like I can tell you, when I started selling real estate 16 years ago, I remember when I started selling like a price per square foot of a house. And I remember thinking that, like kind of you set a benchmark in your head. And like when you first are in something, you just remember that because it was first and new to you. Now, when I'll walk into a house now that I walked into 16 years ago, and I'm like, I cannot believe what someone would have to buy this house for now because I remember selling it for half of this price or whatever. Gosh, and so it's pretty dramatic, when you look at it. So, so what other factors that would you say that are affecting, like national indicators that affect the housing market?
Well, I don't want to get into any type of partisan politics, but one of the big proposals that affects the real estate market is that I believe Vice President Harris has proposed the idea of, and I forget how much the amount is, but giving a tax credit of $25,000 or $50,000 to first-time home buyers. That's the type of thing where even though that sounds like a great policy, especially if you're a real estate agent, a lot of economists look at that and say, that's just going to mean that housing prices can go up by roughly $25,000 to $50,000, right?
True, yeah.
You've got a relatively inelastic. That just means the supply of housing is not going to magically double overnight.
Correct.
And so if you've got a relatively inelastic supply of housing, and all of a sudden you do something that is designed to stimulate the demand for housing, basically all that's going to happen is it's going to make housing prices go up more. And
I'm glad you made that point because that's something that it shows a difference in the political mindsets because on the Republican side, they're proposing some similar things, but it's more on the supply side. It's more incentivizing people to build more homes, which if you have more supply and you have the same amount of demand, what's going to happen to the price? It's going to go down a little bit, which that's a big problem right now. So it's interesting to see the difference in the political ideologies. One is supply side economics,
supply side
right?
Economics basically says, what can we do to increase supply? What can we do?
Correct.
And one thing that's been kind of nice is that for the first time in decades, you've seen both parties unite on the issue of, man, it's way too tough to build housing right now in our country. We've got too much red tape, too much bureaucracy, the regulations are excessive. So you actually had both candidates talking about, okay, well, what can we do to make it easier to increase the supply of housing? It's a long overdue debate, but you're exactly right. The best way if we wanted to make housing more affordable, and this is something that people in real estate too, not everyone who's in real estate wants to see higher and higher housing prices and things like that. They just want to see a more robust market. And I think one of the ways that you get there is if we can lower the cost of building, then even if housing prices go down because of that, if your costs go down too as a builder or somebody in real estate, you're still making money.
Yeah.
That'd be the best scenario for all of us. Have an increase in
Exactly.
supply, build more houses, make it cheaper to do that.
Yeah.
And, you know,
And really, they're talking about a lot about the cost of energy too, because energy goes into all of those metrics, like all of the supply chain when it comes to building a house. That's a big part of the, when COVID shut down all the supply chains all over the world, that's why housing prices, part of the reason they went up because of cost of materials and getting things to different places that were all kind of like, bottlenecks. And so that caused prices to go up. If we can ease some of those, energy costs, now we're becoming politicians here. I don't know if we want to go down that right. Yeah. But I'm glad you brought it up because it was a really good point and a difference in the ideologies behind how to solve the same problem, because everybody agrees on the problem. We just disagree on how to solve it. One of the questions I had, like, what demographic shifts are you seeing and how that plays into the market? Do you fool with demographics?
The short answer is no.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think baby boomers retiring, so you've got a disproportionately older population. But
Well, new household formations is when people typically buy their house, and that's like people coming into the market.
Right.
Typically, that's been 33 years of age, which is, might sound strange because I bought mine a lot sooner.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you did too. But I think normally that as generation, I guess it's millennials that are staying home longer and they're delaying that age. So it's actually pushing demand out. Demand's dropping a little bit. People are not buying as many homes. But I mean, that's definitely a demographic shift that we're seeing.
Because I don't know if I have the confidence to one of the things I was going to say is just demographically, you've got a disproportionately older population. Baby boomers that were born in the 40s and 50s are entering retirement age.
Right.
What you'd kind of expect to see is those are people who have houses, have lived in houses, and all of a sudden, maybe they're moving into a retirement home or moving in with their kids. You'd almost expect that to be a glut of existing housing that's going to enter the market.
Inventory, correct.
And the question is, okay, wait a minute. You got a glut of existing houses. If these people retire and go into, that is going to be on the market, but young people aren't able to buy it as much because we've kind of got a situation now where, as you said, people have extended, people aren't getting married as young, starting families as young, and not buying houses at 27 necessarily anymore. I kind of, bird's eye view would expect that would mean, okay, we're going to probably see a fall in housing prices potentially. But one thing I should ask you, just when you ask about like the local real estate market, when you say local, do you mean North Shore? Do you mean Louisiana?
Correct. Yeah. So what I'm mostly talking about is North Shore.
Okay.
Specifically, Tangipahoa Parish, St. Tammany Parish. Those are my two main parishes that we do business in. Now we do business in a few surrounding parishes, but those are the lion's share. Probably 95% of my business comes from those, or 90% of my business comes from those two parishes. So when I say North Shore, I'm talking about I-12 corridor, growth along that corridor, because there's obviously a lot of growth.
Yeah.
If you know St. Tammany, I mean, even into the Baton Rouge and the parishes over there. So
my father is from Mandeville. He grew up in Old Golden Shores. It's one of the original neighborhoods.
I know it well. Yeah.
Approach, on Shannon Drive.
Yeah. Okay. I know. I've sold stuff on Shannon Drive, as a matter of fact. Yeah.
But my grandparents moved out literally right after Hurricane Katrina, and even though their house had a tree limb in it, it still was the easiest thing to sell ever because that's when a lot of people decided to start moving to the North Shore. The numbers had already been going up for 2 decades before that, but I bring that up because when I was a kid, from the early 90s through the early 2000s, I'd go to Mandeville and it was getting bigger and bigger. But now when I go visit Mandeville, which I don't go as often because now I don't have my grandparents living there, but it is a city. It is a metropolis. It was not that before. It was a growing, nice suburb, but just seeing that type of increase in demand on the North Shore, and there's many good reasons behind it. But I have to imagine, even though the real estate market's done a lot of this over the past 15 years, that St. Tammany, has been steadily on an upward trajectory. Is that accurate?
100% accurate. As a matter of fact, one of the challenges that St. Tammany has is because there's so much traffic there, because it's grown so fast, infrastructurally, they have not been able to keep up with that. And so that's one of the reasons that Tangipahoa has continued to grow, is because our growth hasn't been as fast. We've been able to keep, I say we, Tangipahoa has been able to keep up a little bit more with the infrastructure growth. Not as much traffic. You can get a lot more house for your money in Tangipahoa still. And so, but that I-12 corridor is what continues to grow and expand. And so I think we're, just from a trajectory standpoint, I think we're in for nonstop growth. I mean, it's been doing that, to your point, it's been doing that for 20 to 30 years, and even longer than that.
Yeah.
I don't see anything stopping with that anytime soon because we continue to build. They are building a lot of houses, but we're still in a supply shortage. Interestingly enough, it's about 3 months of inventory on the market, 3 to 4 months of inventory on the North Shore. We want to see 5 to 7 months for a balanced market when supply and demand is balanced.
Yeah, because that's really what I was going to say in terms of the local real estate market is I'm pretty bullish. If I were somebody who owned real estate or was selling real estate in St. Tammany Parish or anywhere on the North Shore, we've seen very good trends for the past couple of decades. I don't see that stopping. And some of that is I could try to give you a more nuanced economic explanation and talk about national indicators and local. But the truth is, when I just go to those areas and I visit the new developments, the new neighborhoods, I'm somebody who's in my early 30s. I say, man, this would be a great place to raise a family. And ultimately, we can talk about interest rates. We can talk about government policies. All those are all important factors that are going to contribute on the margins to people buying a little bit more houses or less. But the biggest factor that's going to affect a region, like St. Tammany or the North Shore area, is just, is this a place where I see myself raising a family?
Exactly.
And the answer to that question for probably 30 years in the region has been absolutely. This is, if I'm going to choose anywhere in Louisiana to be, I want to invest here.
And that's a great point because what you're saying is exactly what your profession is. It's economics. That's supply and demand. If there's constantly people that can see themselves attracted to that area, that means consistent demand. So supply, again, to our earlier point, supply is having trouble keeping up with that. And I don't think they can catch up for a while. And so I think I'm bullish.
Yes.
To your point, that's exactly how I am. I'm bullish. Now, of course, I'm a real estate agent, so of course I'm going to say that. Buy real estate. But it's something I've invested my own personal life heavily in, and I believe in it for my clients. It's not just so I can get a sale. I do think it's actually helpful to you to invest in real estate for lots of reasons. We talked about inflation-induced debt destruction earlier, and then just all the things about home prices going up. They're going to continue to go up. Over time, they always have, with a few exceptions, right? But over time, I think they always will. So.
No, I am somebody who, like you, bullish on the region. And I don't want to say that we're on an island relative to the national economy, but what I've been saying basically about the national housing market is we've seen a lot of ups and downs over the past couple of decades, going back to the Great Recession and the housing bubble of the 2000s.
Absolutely, yeah.
And obviously the spike in inflation and interest rates recently, but we've been relatively insulated in this part of Louisiana.
Yeah, we have.
I actually live in Baton Rouge. And it's funny because we talk about how fast Mandeville, Covington's grown and the traffic issues they've had. It blows my mind. I have colleagues who live in Mandeville, and it takes them longer to get to campus than it does for me because I'm going against the flow in Baton Rouge. Most people are driving into Baton Rouge from Livingston or Ascension. So whenever I get on, I live kind of by the LSU Lake, so very close to LSU's campus.
Gotcha.
So deep in the city, like on
that's not close to the edge.
This is not like Denham Springs area or Shenandoah, if you know that area. But basically, once I get on the interstate, I'm just putting my cruise on 79 and going, and it's a 40-minute drive. Whereas even though they are much closer as the crow flies, if you live in Mandeville, you're stuck in traffic for 20 minutes a lot of times. It's taking you 45 minutes to get to Hammond and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's nice to be going against the flow of traffic, I'm sure.
It is. I always feel so bad looking in that other lane, just like those people are in a parking lot for the next 2 hours of their lives or something. But
Well, is there anything else you'd like to share with us today, Dr. Burns? I really appreciate you coming.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say that kind of connects your profession to my profession is I am not just bullish about the North Shore economy and the real estate sector. I'm bullish about what we're doing at Southeastern because we just hired a couple colleagues in our economics department that are from all over the country, actually, from Michigan, from Washington, D.C., and then somebody from the West Coast. And our pitch to them, because Louisiana is kind of a weird place to sell if you're not from Louisiana. There's great things about it. We got New Orleans down the street. It's a fun city. It's got a big international airport, so you can go visit friends and family very cheaply. So there's really good selling points about it. It's not like we're in the middle of nowhere in the Midwest or something. But Louisiana can be an acquired taste for some, and not all parts of Louisiana have been equally thriving the way that the North Shore has. But what I usually tell them is, look, if you were to cut our state into quadrants, southeast, southwest, northeast, northwest, whatever, this is where you want to be.
Yeah,
and Southeastern is we are the regional school here in Hammond for the most prosperous region of the state that has the two biggest cities, Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and the St. Tammany Parish and the North Shore that has the highest GDP per capita in the state. So that just means it's, on average, people there are, it's the wealthiest part of the state, the fastest growing. And so I'm very bullish about our entire region for the most part. And especially the North Shore area. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah.
We're having a very easy time attracting people to our university for jobs, which to me is just a microcosm of, that's a good sign really for the whole region.
It
if
is.
It's easy to attract people. It hasn't always been easy to convince somebody from New York City or Boston or San Francisco to move to Louisiana. It is right now. And part of that is, and we've been kind of, talking about cost of living type stuff indirectly this whole time, but I lived in New York. I lived in Philadelphia.
Oh, yeah.
I lived in Washington, D.C. My cost of living is about a third of what it was there.
I bet it is, yeah.
And look, there's some things I miss about being up there. I can't go to as many NFL football games or big concerts or things like that. But New Orleans is right there. We got a lot of that stuff, one.
Right, yeah.
And two, I'm willing to make that trade-off if I get to save a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
On lower housing costs, lower cost of living for everything.
Yeah.
Because those savings, okay, I can get a plane ticket and go see Taylor Swift in Boston if I want to.
Right, yeah.
But the fact that our cost of living, we're very
for groceries and gas and your dollars go a lot further down here
Yep.
than they do in those other markets that you talked about. And I visit with agents from all over the country, and I'm talking about our average sales price down here is around $300,000 between St. Tammany and Tangipahoa parishes.
Right.
We're talking about double and triple that most of the time in a lot of other markets.
You're paying a lot more money for a lot less house in a lot of other markets.
Yeah.
And
it's crazy.
Yeah.
So if you see the value, give me a call. We can talk about selling you a house. But thank you so much, Dr. Burns. I really appreciate you coming out today. Yeah. Thanks so much. All right. Have a good one. So thank you so much for joining us today on the Will Frederick Podcast, where we talk about real estate, wealth building, money, and life. Thanks. We'll see you next time.